Good morning, students. Welcome to lectures by Professor Shilpa Khatri. Today's lecture is on class as an agency of social stratification. And for today's lecture, our focus is going to be on Karl Marx's understanding of class as an agency of social stratification. Class has been defined as a type of social stratification by Karl Marx purely in economic terms. He saw it as tangible collectivities having a real social force with a capacity to actually change the society. And he does not see it as an abstraction. However, it sees it as an objective as well as a subjective reality. While analyzing the history, he analyzes it in terms of various modes of production. So he says that typical to every historical epoch, there is a mode of production. And when he refers to as mode of production, he's primarily referring to two things. One, which is means of production, through which production or on which production is actually taking place, and social relations of production, that is, those people who are carrying this production forward. So the combination of the two actually makes the modes of production. Typical to the social relations of production is a dichotomous, antagonistic, exploitative relationship where on the one hand we have the haves who own all the means of production, while on the other they are the haves-not who own nothing. I know it sounds like a very elementary and a simplistic understanding of history. Well, that is how he has been portraying history throughout from the first stage of mode of production to the last stage of mode of production, which we shall be doing under historical materialism. What we need to understand at the time being is that the relationship between the haves and the haves-not is an antagonistic relationship, and this is vis-a-vis the means of production. So those who own the means of production are the privileged one, and those who do not own the means of production are those who are constantly being exploited by the haves, by the owners of the means of production. So this is how he's tracing the history. While tracing the history, he says that there are distinct modes of production, as I've already mentioned. He begins with primitive communism, followed by ancient society, Asiatic society, and then you have a feudal society and capitalistic society. These are prime 5 mode of production, which we are going to first analyze and then carry forward. So if we move on to the first, which is primitive communism, this is one of the, illustratively speaking, that form of mode of production where there is no private ownership of means of production. There is a totally classless society. There is no division of labor specifically defined, maybe a sexual division of labor or maybe a specialized division of labor in terms of a magic man or a medicine man or so on and so forth. However, here everybody is contributing according to their abilities and receiving according to their needs. So it's a absolutely peaceful society. There is no antagonism altogether. Then he says that we move on to the second mode of production, which he titles as ancient society. In ancient society, the focus or the means of production is slavery, and the two social relations of production are masters, who are the haves, and the slaves, who are the haves-not. The relationship between the masters and the slaves is an antagonistic relationship. There's a constant dialectics between the two relationships. There's between the two communities, between the two categories, between the two classes. And there is a lot of conflict because of that. Then we move on to the third mode of production, which is the Asiatic society. In Asiatic society, the focus is on estate as the means of production, and the patricians are the haves and the plebeians are the haves-not. Now, the interesting part before I move further to the feudal mode of production is that throughout history, the focus till capitalism, that is till this fifth mode of production, the focus is going to be on the existent haves, say for instance in an ancient society, and the emerging haves. So the focus is not so much so on the relationship between the haves and the haves-not in a particular mode of production. However, till the capitalist society, the focus which Karl Marx is trying to draw of the audience is on the existent haves and the emerging haves. So if I take you to the next slide, you will be able to understand. He says what is happening is that in the ancient mode of production, the existent haves are the masters. However, these masters, as is the human nature, man is primarily a very dissatisfied animal. Now, because he is a dissatisfied animal, so there is a struggle against nature, which does not stop even when his needs are gratified, are fulfilled. There is a constant evolving of new set of needs. And in this urge of appropriation, in this constant evolving of new needs, there is a mass competition amongst the haves. Amongst which haves? Amongst the existent haves, say for instance, in the ancient society, if I take, in the ancient society, the competition is amongst the masters who are the existent haves, and from amongst the masters, we have the development of and evolving of a new set of haves who are the patricians. So now what is happening is the society, that means at one point of time, there are two modes of production which are existing simultaneously. So in the ancient society or the ancient mode of production, you can see elements of the Asiatic society also walking into. So there is a competition amongst the haves, amongst the existent haves, that's the masters, and amongst the emerging haves, that is the patricians. Similarly, in the Asiatic society, in the Asiatic mode of production, there would be a conflict between, a competition between the then existent haves, that is patricians, and the then emerging haves, which is the lords. In the feudal society or the feudal mode of production, the conflict would be between the then existent haves, that's the lord, and the then emerging haves, that's the capitalist. So if you are trying to understand, the problem currently is not between the haves and the haves not. The problem is between the existent haves and the emerging haves. So in the ancient society, it is between the masters and the patricians. In the Asiatic society, it is between the patricians and the lords. In the feudal society, it is between the lords and the capitalists. So I hope this particular point is clear to each one of you. Now, what is happening that each one of the haves, the emerging and the existent haves, while they are competing, they want to surpass. They want to surpass each other, either by getting more slaves or by greater estates or more land. And in this struggle, Marx claims the class of the haves, of the existent haves, as well as the emerging haves are combined, the class of the haves starts shrinking. So if the class of the haves starts shrinking, then what is going to mushroom? The class of the exploited, the class of the haves not. So what Marx is basically trying to focus here is the transition from one mode of production to another mode of production, and yet another, and yet another, and then to the capitalistic society. The transition is primarily not because of peace. The engine of progress, he insists, is struggle. Antithetical forces are generating social change by their tension and struggle. And this, he says, is what is to be understood as a dialectics. So, the history of all hitherto existing societies, he wrote, is the history of class struggle. This class struggle till capitalism is between the existent haves and the emerging haves, and post-capitalistic, or from the capitalistic period to be more precise, the structure is such that the struggle is between the existent haves and the existent haves not. This is primarily because the only objective of a capitalist is appropriation of profits to the maximum. And this is the cause of dialectics, in simple sense that there are certain antithetical forces which are generating tensions, and these forces are referred to as dialectics, and this particular transition is referred to as dialectical materialism. So the history which is being understood in terms of material things and is thereby referred to as historical materialism is actually because of the dialectics that's happening within the society, and to be specific, within the classes. Now, what is dialectical materialism? Dialectical materialism should be seen as a synthesis of two terms, should be seen as a synthesis of the term dialectics with that of materialism. Dialectics is a concept which has been put across by Hegel. However, materialism is a concept which was put across by Feuerbach, and the two concepts by Hegel and Feuerbach were combined, and a consolidated concept of dialectical materialism was introduced by Karl Marx. Now, what are these laws of dialectics? The first law of dialectics says everything is related to everything else. So there is an interesting understanding behind this, and the understanding is to be seen in this particular slide, which is known as the base-superstructure distinction. Now, what is Karl Marx basically trying to say? He says the base of every society is mode of production. Primarily, it is economics. And what is economy? Economy is mode of production. So the focus of the base is the means of production. That is, all the things which you need to produce, could be machines, factories, land, raw materials, which are all owned by the haves. And along with the means of production, the other part of mode of production is the relations of production, where the haves are exploiting the haves not. Now, this constitutes the base of every society. So that is why it's popularly known as the economic deterministic theory. And when in the next lecture, we're going to do a critical analysis of Marxian understanding of social stratification, we shall revert back to these particular slides. On this particular base, on this particular economy, is constructed a superstructure. This superstructure would include everything. So would include your education, would include your family, would include religion, would include politics, would include mass media, would include law. So he says everything is related to everything else, in simple terms, that everything is related to economy. So what are the ruling ideas? The ruling ideas are primarily the ideas of the ruling class. So in one of the slides, I had mentioned ruling ideas. Maybe it's yeah. So it's right here in front of me. So the ideas of the ruling class are the ruling ideas. So who's going to determine what is going to be the education system like? It's going to be the haves. Who's going to determine what is going to be the legal framework like? It's going to be the haves. Who's going to decide what's going to be the political structure like? It's going to be haves, because haves not are an insignificant part of this particular society, or for that matter, for him, the entire history, because the history is based or standing on modes of production, which is the combination of means of production and the exploitative relations of production. Now, why is it that so we will actually also try and understand a little later that why is it that the haves not are such an insignificant part of the society, or of the modes of production, or of history. So everything is related to everything else. I hope it's clear to each one of you, which is the first law of dialectics. The second law, in fact, before we move on to the second law of dialectics, which states that everything is constantly changing, it is very important to understand that there is a difference between the Marxian understanding of nature and the metaphysical understanding of nature. When I say Marxian, I mean the dialectical understanding of nature and the metaphysical understanding of nature. The dialectical understanding of nature states that nature cannot be understood as accidental agglomeration of unconnected phenomenon, nor is it to be isolated from the surrounding phenomenon. So everything is related to everything else. Moving on to the second, where the laws of dialectics states that everything is constantly changing. Now, nature is not in a state of rest or immobility, states Marx, and this is very true. The only place where you will find it very weird is that how can you define history taking a particular passage of time? Because being a sociologist, you understand that there is nothing like uniformity. There is nothing like a consistent and atypical movement of society, globally speaking, from one mode of production to another mode of production. However, as sociologists, we are very familiar with the fact that nothing is constant. Society is constantly changing, and that is what makes today yesterday, and makes tomorrow today, and so on and so forth. The third law of dialectics is that there is a change from quantitative to qualitative. Now, the process of development should neither be understood as something which is circular in nature, or as a simple repetition of what is already occurring. So then how should we understand the process of development? Dialectics insists, unlike metaphysics, that understand the process of development as an onward and an upward movement, as a transition from something which was old to a new qualitative state, from simple to complex, from lower to higher. So development is inbuilt in the laws of dialectics, and therefore the changes from quantitative to qualitative. The fourth, which is the motor mechanism of change, is conflict. And we just illustratively showed when we moved on, and it'd be nice if I could revert back to those slides. So there is this transition from one mode of production to another mode of production, and this transition is brought about by conflict between in ancient mode of production, between the existent haves, that's the masters, and the emerging haves, that's the plebeians. In Asiatic society, then the mode of production, when it is Asiatic, the transformation takes place between the existent haves, that's the patricians, and the emerging haves, that's the lords. In feudal society, it takes place between the existent haves, that's the lords, and the emerging haves, that's the capitalists. So there is this, and of course, we shall see it a little later, that the transition from the capitalist society onwards is because of the conflict between the existent haves, that's the capitalists, and the emerging haves, that's the proletariats. So dialectics holds that these internal contradictions are inherent in all things, and it is this which constitutes the process of development. In fact, the process of development from the lower to the higher, which we just saw when we said that the change is from quantitative to qualitative, this change is not through an harmonious unflowing or unfolding of the phenomenon, but it is basically revealed as contradictions. It's revealed as struggle. So there is this very interesting thing which Karl Marx puts across, and of course it's a part of laws of dialectics, that the movement from thesis to antithesis is because of contradictions. And these contradictions bring about change, and there is something new which is formulated, and that is referred to as a synthesis. So we need to understand that why does he say that conflict, the motor mechanism of change, is conflict, which is the fourth fourth law of dialectics, which is put across, of course, taken from Hegel and Feuerbach. So this is something that we have already done, the base superstructure distinction, when we were talking about the first law of dialectics, where we said that everything is related to everything else. And now, if you remember, I was speaking to you as what was so typical about the capitalist society, that the earlier transition, which was from, or the conflict which was amongst the existent haves and the emerging haves, now transforms itself into the existent haves and the existent haves not. Now, we need to understand the structure of capitalism to understand this particular thing. Now, what is happening in this structure of capitalism is that till capitalism, it was not as if the workers were working under the same roof. They were working on different lands, on different estates. They were tied to different masters as slaves. And so an essential part of their everyday life was that these haves not were living under a false illusion, or what Marx refers to as false consciousness that they are a mere class in themselves. So what they are undergoing is basically in isolation. The suffering is absolutely exclusive to them as an individual and not as a collectivity. They are primarily just a simple collection of workers who are sharing a common class position, and actually were having no collective awareness because they had not got together. They never had the time to get together because there was this constant exploitation and appropriation that was taking place. Now what happens is, under the structure of capitalism, where there are large number of workers working under the same roof, there is a transformation of the class of workers, of the proletariats, of the laborers, from a class in itself to a class for itself. So from a simple collection of workers, now they become a mass of workers working towards a collective cause. So it's very essential to understand that under the capitalistic mode of production, there are a few features to understand the capitalistic mode of production. First being that there is a private ownership of means of production. The second being that the commodities which are being produced are produced for the market, and in order to stay competitive, the capitalists or the bourgeoisie will now have to extract as much of labor as possible from the workers at the lowest possible cost. Now, the surplus value which is being appropriated from the labor, this was seen as a major source of profit. And so in this structure, there is a new kind of a problem which is emerging, and a problem which is referred to as alienation. To what is alienation? Alienation refers to the estrangement of individuals, which and a term which was basically introduced by Hegel and had philosophical and religious meanings when Hegel referred to alienation. But Karl Marx, in his work The Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts of 1844, he transformed it into a sociological concept. Now, as a sociological concept, he sees alienation both as a subjective state as well as a structural category. Why as a subjective state? Because it is involving the feelings of individual. It is involving that estrangement. It is involving that rarefication, that objectification of a human. And why a structural category? Because Marx is of the opinion that it is typical to capitalism, a structure or a mode of production called capitalism. Now, when this alienation is taking place, alienation is taking place primarily at four levels. It is taking place from the product. So now what is happening is, under capitalism as a system of private ownership of means of production, there is a deprivation of humans in general and the laborers in particular. As a result, essentially, the source of self-worth or self-identity is actually done away with. You would require a lot of philosophical understanding, because this is an experience and it is not an object, that a tangible thing that I could actually put across it as points. So to understand it as a feeling, I'm taking the last point here. How? From the self. Because what is capitalism doing? What is the mode of production of capitalism doing? The mode of production of capitalism is actually squeezing out the human self from you, because you have been reduced to an totally exploited class. So your worth has become absolutely redundant, because the only identity that you have is in terms of n number of hours which you need to contribute in a process of production, which actually does not belong to you, because those hours which you are contributing in the process of production, lead to a product which now is far from your reach, because you don't have the basic pocket to purchase that product. The product is no more your creativity. The product is as if standing as a rarefied object away from you. Now, this alienated worker who is estranged from the product which he creates and also from the process of production, which for him, as I told you, has been reduced to a mere survival issue, he is also estranged from his own humanity, because the transformation of nature into useful objects has become fundamental facet of the human condition under capitalism. And when I say useful objects, the utility is far beyond the capacity and thinking of the have. Thus, the worker is alienated from his own species being, from being what it is to be a human. Now, this is where, and I would want to come back to the element of false consciousness and class consciousness. This is where the element of class consciousness actually takes place. The worker realizes that what he is undergoing, the exploitation, the appropriation, the rarefication which he is undergoing, is not typical to him as an individual, but is typical to him as a collectivity. And therefore, he says that class transforms itself from a category, a collectivity in itself, to a category for itself, as a tangible category which is in a position to bring about change. Because the social structure of capitalism actually takes away, what do I say, the soul of what is labor actually defined as. Labor is to be seen in terms of three things. It is to be seen as a creative activity, number one. No more it's a creative activity. It is an activity which is primarily being done for market as an economic pursuit. Secondly, labor was carried out in cooperation with other. Now here there is no cooperation amongst the co-workers, because there is a total isolation from one's own species being. And thirdly, through this particular labor, the world outside was transformed. Now here nothing was transformed. No kind of transformation was taking place. The only thing was happening was appropriation and exploitation of the has not. And greater the appropriation and exploitation, greater the profits. And the demand also on the capitalist was intense, because as I told you, that there is this constant competition amongst the existent and the emerging haves also. So they also feared that there would be a set who would further throw them into the category of has not, and would maintain in isolation the elitist position of being a have. Now, so what does Karl Marx posit as a solution? So what happens is, in this peak kind of a situation, what happens is the haves not, now there is class consciousness, class awareness, they get together. They get together as a collectivity, and they revolt. They revolt against whom? They revolt against the haves. So there is a revolutionary unity of the proletariat which is actually taking place. There is a revolution by the proletariats, and by this revolution there is an absolutely upside down kind of a situation which takes place. The so-called haves not now take over all the power, all the control, and they establish a dictatorship. Karl Marx says this is a temporal phase in the society, in the history, and once this dictatorship of proletariat takes place, then this is, which is a temporal phase, when everything is going to settle, when the critical phase is going to be done away with, we would finally lead to a state-based control of all the modes of production, which is referred to as a socialism. This again is a temporary phase. finally, he says, and I really want to put across, I have the urge to put across that this is far from reality. However, he says that there's going to be a final stage of modern rational communism, where once again everybody would be receiving according to their needs and would contribute according to their abilities. This is referred to as historical materialism. So, from this particular lecture, the important issues that you all need to understand are number one, we need to understand what is the concept of class. We need to understand, there could be a short note on the concept of class. We need to understand the idea of modes of production as a combination of means of production and social relations of production. We need to understand that the social relations of production are relations which are not very affectionate kind of a relationship. They are very exploitative relationships. We also need to understand that what is this concept of historical materialism, wherein the movement till the capitalist society is a movement which brings, of course, through conflict, but conflict between the existent haves and the emerging haves, and it is a structure of it is a structure of the capitalist society where the change which actually comes about is a change between the existent haves and the existent haves not. We need to understand the concept of dialectical materialism. We need to understand the base superstructure. We need to understand this transformation under the capitalistic mode of production from false consciousness to class consciousness. We need to understand what is more about capitalistic mode of production, especially the concept of alienation. How is it a subjective state of feelings, located within a structural category? So, and then finally, or well, this is what it is all about, the concept of alienation, and then of course this idea of what are the solutions. So there's going to be this phase of a dictatorship of proletariat followed by socialism and then a modern national capitalism, communism, and interestingly he says history would come to an end. Now of course it's far from reality, but then we need to understand that this is what we need to actually put across without a critical understanding, because till the time the substance is not very objectively put to the audience, we will not be able to do a critical understanding of this particular concept. I hope you have understood every point in this particular lecture. If you haven't, please revert back to me through my blog. I would also be putting up my lecture notes, the narratives of the entire lecture today. And so you could follow me on Dr. Shilpa Khatri Babbar. We can make a difference. God bless.